Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book. In Season 6, Episode 32, we delve into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition, to explore the complex tapestry of the United Kingdom, asking, what happens when the constituent parts yearn for an identity separate from the whole? Our mission today is, well, to really understand the historical journey of identity, autonomy, and self-governance within the United Kingdom. We're going to dive into the stories of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, all of which were, alongside England, part of Great Britain back in 1900. It's fascinating how, even under one parliament in London, their desires for self-rule and distinct identities varied so dramatically.
Indeed. And to set the stage, in 1900, the UK was made up of these four main parts: England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, all governed from London. But their historical paths to this point were really quite different. Scotland, for instance, had been an independent country with its own parliament right up until the 1707 Act of Union. That abolished it, sending Scottish MPs down to London. Ireland, too, had its own parliament until 1800, again abolished by the British government. Irish MPs then had to travel to Westminster. Wales, though, that was different. It never had its own parliament. Welsh representatives had always sat directly in London at Westminster.
And that really highlights England's overwhelming dominance, doesn't it? The 1901 census showed something like, three-quarters of the UK's population lived in England. London was undeniably the center of power, both England's capital and the UK's capital. So for many English people, being English just sort of was being British, same thing. But this was the feeling everywhere, right? In Ireland, Scotland, Wales, there was this powerful counter-sentiment, a feeling they weren't getting a fair deal from an English-dominated parliament. They often blamed their problems on London, and they were fiercely determined to preserve their separate identities, their cultures, like the Welsh keen to preserve their language. This led to growing demands for self-government, or devolution as we call it.
Definitely. And among these constituent parts, nationalist feelings were, undeniably strongest in Ireland. You saw massive support for nationalist parties there, like the Irish Nationalist Party and later Sinn Féin. Eventually, of course, Southern Ireland gained independence as the Irish Free State in 1922. However, most of Ulster, which became Northern Ireland, remained within the UK. And for over 50 years, from 1921 to 72, Northern Ireland actually had its own parliament, Stormont. It had considerable powers. London really only kept control over things like foreign affairs, defense, and income tax.
Okay, so Stormont had significant control on paper. But even with that, Northern Ireland was plagued by these really deep-seated issues right from the start. The border itself, for one thing, was highly artificial, wasn't it? It enclosed areas like Tyrone and Fermanagh with strong Catholic majorities who really wanted to be part of the new Free State. They were bitterly disappointed when the Boundary Commission didn't change it. This meant over a third of Northern Ireland's population was Roman Catholic, and many felt the whole province should have just joined the Republic. And then you add severe economic hardship on top of that. Massive unemployment, over 30% by 1931. And the lowest standards of housing, roads, schools, healthcare, anywhere in Britain. A really tough situation.
And what's crucial to grasp is that politics in Northern Ireland wasn't about, normal party lines. It was fundamentally sectarian, deeply divided. Protestants were largely represented by the Unionist Party, determined to stay in the UK. Catholics tended towards nationalist groups, hoping for eventual unification with the South. The Protestant, Unionist-dominated Stormont government systematically discriminated against Catholics in housing, jobs, education, public appointments. They even gerrymandered constituency boundaries to maintain control. And the armed forces, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, and the Auxiliary B Specials, they often seem to function primarily to keep Catholics under control rather than serving everyone impartially.
It just paints this picture of a profound power imbalance, doesn't it? Utter helplessness for the Catholic population. With a permanent Unionist majority at Stormont, they saw no democratic way to change things. And the British government in London largely just stood by, didn't intervene. So this frustration just simmered and often boiled over into sectarian violence, like the Belfast riots in 1935. Even after World War II, the unfair treatment continued. Unemployment for Catholics was like 3 times higher than for Protestants. Key industries, like the Harland and Wolff shipyards, the civil service, the RUC, overwhelmingly Protestant. There's that powerful quote from Eamon McCann, the civil rights leader. He said, "The Education Act of 1944 gave Catholic working-class children the chance to go to grammar school and university, but we couldn't even get a job as a lavatory cleaner at Derry Guildhall. That made us angry." Just total exclusion from influence. As the historian C.J. Bartlett put it, nowhere else in the Western world were Catholics so much excluded from positions of influence. Though Protestants defended their actions, right? Seeing Catholics as basically working toward unification with the Republic, and things like the IRA campaign in the 50s just solidified that resolve.
Yes, exactly. But despite that grim backdrop, there were attempts at reform. In 1963, a new Unionist Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill, came in with more progressive ideas. He genuinely sought to treat Catholics more fairly, started some gradual reforms, tried to boost industry. He even met with the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland in 1965, which was a big deal then. This encouraged the formation of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association in 1967, a nonviolent group wanting equal rights. It even had some moderate Protestant support. But things escalated. The British government urged O'Neill to speed up reforms. This alarmed the extreme Protestants, people like Reverend Ian Paisley, who feared losing their supremacy. He formed the DUP and started making these, violently anti-Catholic speeches. Then a planned civil rights march in Londonderry in October 1968 was banned. It went ahead anyway and erupted in violence. The RUCs, water cannons, batons, it was all over the news.
Yeah, the Derry March feels like a real turning point. From there, it was just this rapid descent into chaos. Violence escalated all through 1969, more protest marches, Protestant counter-demonstrations. The Unionist Party split. O'Neill was forced to resign in April. Then August 1969, the violence peaked with an Apprentice Boys March. Catholics were attacked, barricaded themselves into the Bogside area of Free Derry. Riots broke out in other cities too, like the Falls Road in Belfast. Protestant gangs destroyed Catholic homes. It was awful. The Northern Ireland government just completely lost control. They had to request British help. James Callaghan, the Home Secretary, then sent in British troops in August 69. He emphasized their role was to safeguard the rights of all citizens, not maintain Protestant supremacy. And initially, Catholics actually welcomed them, saw them as protectors. Westminster tried to seem impartial. They set up the Hunt Inquiry, reorganized and disarmed the RUC, abolished the B specials. Local government reforms to fairer electoral districts, housing allocation, and appeal body. These measures did improve things for Catholics somewhat.
They did. But somehow the situation still deteriorated. It led eventually to direct rule from London. See, the concessions to Catholics provoked this feared Protestant backlash. Riots when the B specials were disbanded, the formation of Protestant paramilitary groups like the UVF, and then, crucially, the IRA split. The officials were more moderate, but the provisionals, the PIRA, they launched a military campaign, terrorism, aimed at driving the British out entirely. This campaign, the bombings and shootings, turned many Catholics against the British troops, who are now conducting house searches, making arrests. The first British soldier was killed in February 71. In response, the Northern Ireland PM, Brian Faulkner, introduced internment in August 71, locking people up indefinitely without trial. That just infuriated the Catholic community. More riots, more Protestant attacks, and then the absolute tragedy of Bloody Sunday in January 1972. A Catholic civil rights march in Derry, clashes with troops, 13 unarmed civilians shot dead. Worldwide condemnation. By March 72, the province was just chaotic. Edward Heath's government in London felt it had no choice. They suspended Stormont and imposed direct rule from London. William Whitelaw became the first Secretary of State.
So, direct rule from London. But that didn't mean an easy path forward, did it? The British government, they bravely attempted to set up a new power-sharing government, trying to be fair to both sides. But these efforts just kept getting undermined. Ongoing violence from paramilitaries on both sides, deep distrust between the politicians. Through the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, Unionist politicians, especially hardliners like Paisley, just largely refused to compromise on sharing power. And the IRA continued its brutal campaign, targeting critics, politicians, even bombing targets in England like the Brighton Hotel during the Conservative Party conference. It just seemed like this intractable conflict. Attempts at agreements, like Sunningdale in 73, the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 85, they all failed to bring lasting peace.
It was a truly protracted and tragic period, absolutely. So many lives lost. But amidst all those setbacks, a gradual movement towards peace did begin, very slowly. Blatant discrimination against Catholics, the kind seen under Stormont, largely became a thing of the past thanks to Westminster's oversight. And the British government poured millions into Northern Ireland to improve facilities, infrastructure. Economic recovery in Britain also helped a bit, brought some new investment, new jobs, especially in peaceful periods. It made peace seem more, beneficial for ordinary people. International pressure played a role, too, especially after 9/11. The U.S., which had been, let's say, a source of unofficial funding for the IRA for years, stopped that and threw its full weight behind the peace process.
Right. And then, 1998, Tony Blair's new Labour government. That seems like a real shift. He made Northern Ireland peace an absolute top priority, didn't he? Appointed Mo Mallum as Secretary of State. And after months of incredibly complex talks involving all the parties, the British and Irish governments, they finally reached a deal. On Good Friday, April 10th, 1998, the Good Friday Agreement. It felt like a landmark moment. It established that Northern Ireland would stay part of the UK as long as the majority wished it. But crucially, the Republic of Ireland gave up its constitutional claim to the North. It set up a new power-sharing assembly, Protestants and Catholics governing together. A North-South Council for cooperation, prisoners were released, paramilitaries were supposed to give up their weapons, decommission them, and it was overwhelmingly approved. Huge majority in the Republic, about three-quarters in Northern Ireland. David Trimble, the Ulster Unionist leader, and John Hume, the SDLP leader, got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. A moment of real hope.
Huge hope, yes. But even then, challenges persisted straight away. About half of Protestants actually voted against the agreement. They didn't trust it. And then the horror of the Omagh bombing by the real IRA, a splinter group, just months later. 29 people killed, a terrible setback. And that issue of IRA weapons decommissioning, it remained a massive stumbling block for years. It led to periods of deep distrust, the suspension of the power-sharing assembly more than once. But a major turning point finally came in the summer of 2005. The IRA ordered its units to dump arms, put them beyond use. General John de Chastelain, the Canadian overseeing it, confirmed that much of their weaponry was indeed beyond use. That breakthrough paved the way for the St. Andrews Agreement in 2006, setting a clear timetable to get devolved government back up and running. And then in March 2007, you had that truly extraordinary moment. A new power-sharing government took office, with Reverend Ian Paisley, the hardliner of hardliners for decades, as First Minister, and Martin McGuinness, a former IRA commander, as his deputy First Minister, standing side by side. Unthinkable just years before.
Incredible scenes. Just incredible. So looking back, what does this tell you? Why was peace finally achieved after all those decades of conflict and failed attempts?
Well, I think several key factors converged around that time. Firstly, the vast majority of the Catholic population by then just desperately wanted peace. They largely accepted that staying in the UK was the reality, especially as many of the original civil rights demands had actually been met by Westminster over the years. Discrimination wasn't the same issue it had been. Economically, as we said, Northern Ireland had started to benefit from stability. Unemployment was at its lowest level for years. There was a clear, tangible interest in permanent peace for jobs and investment. The sustained pressure from the US was vital, and the tireless efforts of key individuals. John Hume, for instance, was crucial in persuading Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, that negotiations were the way forward, and maybe even Paisley could be brought around. And you have to give credit to the Northern Ireland secretaries, Mullum won Nationalist Trust, Peter Mandelson kept Unionists on board, and Tony Blair himself. Andrew Rawnsley wrote about Blair's courage, ingenuity, and persistence, negotiating skills, his flair for creative ambiguity, sheer effort of will. He really drove it. And finally, the hardliners on both sides reached a point of realization. Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness accepted violence wouldn't achieve unification, and power sharing was better than no power. And Ian Paisley, once convinced the IRA really had given up violence, responded positively. He admitted bigotry couldn't go on forever, and perhaps the prospect of becoming First Minister was an added incentive too. Of course, there's still lingering opposition from extremists, but the core breakthrough is held. It shows what persistence, dialogue, and maybe just sheer exhaustion with conflict can achieve.
It really does. Okay, let's shift focus now. From the really intense journey of Northern Ireland, let's turn to Scotland, a very different part of the UK with its own unique path towards self-rule. What's striking, reading Lowe's, is that back in 1900, despite Scotland having had its own kingdom and parliament until 1707, there was apparently no great desire at this time for home rule as there was in Ireland. Is that right? Most Scots felt they'd done okay out of the Union.
That seems to be the case, yes. Scotland certainly maintained a very strong cultural and administrative identity within the Union. They kept their own distinct system of law, their own courts, their own churches, their education system, which many Scots regarded as superior to England's, actually. Higher literacy rates, 4 universities compared to England's 2 at the time. They also had administrative devolution quite early on, their own education department from 1872, a Scottish office, and a Secretary of State for Scotland from 1884 to handle local affairs. Politically, Scotland was a liberal stronghold back then, and while there were some early stirrings of home rule, inspired by Ireland, bills were introduced in Parliament, even past the Commons a few times before World War I, but they were always defeated in the House of Lords. So consistent resistance to formal devolution then.
Right, so early attempts didn't get far. But then the 1920s saw a different kind of Scottish nationalism emerge. The Scottish National Party, the SNP, formed in 1934, pushing for urgent self-government. What was driving that renewed push?
It seems to have been a blend of economic and cultural factors, mainly. Economically, Scotland suffered badly from post-war inflation and then the Great Depression in the 30s. Unemployment was often higher than in England, 30% in 1932, even higher in some towns. And there was this feeling, right or wrong, that Scotland was paying more than its fair share into the British treasury. Though the English argued the opposite, of course. Culturally, there was a definite desire to preserve a distinct Scottish identity, protect it from English and American influences. Thinkers like Hugh MacDiarmid were part of this. But for decades, the SNP had very little parliamentary impact. They won one by-election in 1945, lost it straight away. There was an underlying sentiment, though. The Scottish Covenant in 1949 collected 2 million signatures demanding a separate Scottish parliament. So the feeling was there, simmering away.
Okay, simmering away. Until the late 1960s, when the SNP really seemed to take off. What changed? Again, economics seemed key. Britain's pretty unimpressive economic performance made many Scots think, maybe we could do better on our own. And then came the discovery of North Sea oil in the late 60s, early 70s. The SNP famously campaigned on It's Scotland's oil. That was a powerful message. Plus resentment over rising unemployment again in some areas. Politically, the SNP had that sensational by-election win in Hamilton in 1967, a solid Labour seat. They started winning big in local government too. Membership shot up. And this success started to force the other parties, especially Labour, who dominated Scotland, to take devolution seriously, right?
Absolutely. It put devolution firmly on the map. Even the Conservative leader, Edward Heath, came out in favor of a Scottish Assembly in 1968. The government set up the Kilbrandon Commission that same year to look into devolution for both Scotland and Wales. Its report came out in 1973. By the October 1974 general election, the SNP won 11 seats at Westminster, taking 30% of the Scottish vote, a huge result. Labour won that election with only a tiny majority, so they really needed the support of the SNP and Plaid Cymru MPs. That's why they decided to press ahead with devolution plans.
Okay, so it looked like devolution was finally going to happen. But then, disagreement stalled the process. The SNP wanted much more power than London was willing to give, especially full tax and economic powers. London refused, insisted the Secretary of State should have a veto. There was also debate about reducing the number of Scottish MPs at Westminster if they got their own parliament, and concerns from England, particularly the north of England, about Scotland getting special treatment. Okay. The government's eventual devolution bill ended up being seen as pretty weak, wasn't it? No real tax powers, little control over key areas like industry. Satisfied nobody, really.
Yeah.
And this all led to that pivotal 1979 referendum.
That's right. And the 1979 referendum had that crucial and controversial condition attached. It wasn't just a majority of those voting. 40% of the entire Scottish electorate had to vote yes for it to pass. In the end, a majority of those who actually voted did vote in favor, 51.6%. But because turnout wasn't high enough, that only represented 33% of the total electorate. So it failed the 40% rule. The plans were dropped, and Nationalist support slumped quite sharply afterwards. The SNP only won 2 seats in the general election that followed soon after.
Wow. So close, yet so far. No devolution then, not in 79. But let's fast forward. The 1980s, the Thatcher years, Labour became incredibly strong in Scotland, didn't they, winning most of the seats by 1987. Lowe suggests this was partly a reaction against Thatcherite policies, which hit Scottish manufacturing hard, leading to high unemployment. And things like the poll tax were deeply unpopular in Scotland. Both Thatcher and her successor, John Major, were firmly against devolution. They thought it would lead to the breakup of the UK. But Tony Blair's Labour Party took a different view. They became quite enthusiastic about devolution, pledging a Scottish parliament with tax-raising powers. Labour's massive landslide victory in the 1997 UK general election sealed the deal. The Conservatives lost all their Scottish MPs. Labour won 56 seats in Scotland. And in a referendum in September 1997, the result was decisive. Good turnout, 74% voted for a Scottish parliament, 63% for it to have tax-raising powers. So devolution finally proceeded. The first elections for the new Edinburgh Parliament were held in May 1999.
Exactly. And the Scottish Parliament, using proportional representation, quickly started to carve out its own path. Initially, a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition government with Donald Dewar as the first minister. The SNP became the main opposition. They brought in laws making Scotland quite different from England quite quickly. More generous provision for the elderly, no university tuition fees for Scottish students studying in Scotland, new property laws in the Highlands, a ban on public smoking well before England introduced it. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. Donald Dewar died tragically in 2000. There were scandals, like the soaring cost of the new Parliament building at Holyrood went from 55 million to nearly $500 million, became an object of ridicule for a while. But the SNP kept pushing for greater powers, even independence. And by 2006, polls showed over half of Scots favored complete independence. Then, in the May 2007 Scottish Parliament election, the SNP became the largest single party. Alex Salmond became First Minister, leading a minority government. It just highlights how these cultural and economic drivers, combined with political opportunity, created this really strong, growing movement for self-determination over time.
Absolutely. And I love that Andrew Moore analogy you mentioned from the book, Scotland and England, like two pieces of pizza being gently pulled apart. Still together, but now connected only by strings of molten cheese. It captures that evolving relationship so well, doesn't it? That ongoing tension.
It really does. Path to Devolution was different again, perhaps quieter, but still offers its own fascinating insights. Wales was officially united with England way back in 1536, yet remarkably, it preserved a very strong sense of national identity through its distinct culture, its nonconformist religions, and especially its language. Unlike the Irish and Scots, Welsh people didn't really emigrate overseas in large numbers. Instead, they tended to move within Wales, particularly to the booming South Wales coal mining valleys in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1900, over half the population still spoke Welsh, and about 30% of those spoke only Welsh. And the British government actually showed some sympathy towards preserving Welsh culture, particularly the language and education from the 1880s onwards. The University of Wales was founded in 1893.
So strong cultural identity, definitely. But what about the political issues before World War I? Lowe points to the 1902 Education Act, causing major controversy. Nonconformists were very strong in Wales, and they were furious that the act used local taxes, their rates, to support Anglican church schools. David Lloyd George, a Welsh MP, of course, led the opposition. It cost the Conservatives dearly. They lost all their Welsh seats in the 1906 election. There was also this long campaign against the Anglican Church itself, seen as an English state church imposed on Wales. A bill to disestablish the church in Wales eventually passed in 1914, though implementation was postponed by the war. And there was a Welsh Home Rule movement, Simrafite, but Lowe notes there was no great interest in it at this time compared to Ireland. Early bills for a Welsh parliament were dropped because of the war.
That's right. Then, the period between the wars was economically devastating for Wales. Because it was so heavily dependent on coal mining, Wales suffered incredibly high unemployment, 36.5% in 1932, the highest in Britain. Some towns were even worse, like 74% in Bryn Mawr in 1934. It was named a special area needing help, but little improved. Yet crucially, and this is a key contrast with Ireland and even Scotland to some extent, these terrible economic difficulties did not spark a major nationalist outpost in Wales. Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party, founded in 1925, remained very small. Few members, won no seats before 1939. Industrial South Wales, the most populous area, generally supported the Labour Party, which strongly advocated for maintaining the union with Britain. They saw strength in unity.
That is a fascinating difference, isn't it? Why economic hardship fueled nationalism so strongly elsewhere, but less so in Wales at that time. Plaid Cymru continued to struggle for support even after World War II. Labour governments weren't sympathetic to devolution, though a Conservative government did make some gestures, appointing a Minister for Welsh Affairs, making Cardiff the official capital in 1956. And economic improvements from new investment probably kept most people reasonably content within the UK framework.
Generally, yes. But then the 1960s saw a definite surge in support for Welsh nationalism, particularly focused on culture and language. There was an incredibly impassioned radio broadcast in 1962 by the veteran nationalist Saunders Lewis. He spoke about the decline of the Welsh language and culture, and it led directly to the formation of the Welsh Language Society. They engaged in civil disobedience, defacing English-only road signs, damaging TV masts, relaying English programs. Some extremists even turned to violence, targeting post offices, English-owned holiday homes, and Plaid Cymru started having some electoral success. Gwynfor Evans won their first ever parliamentary seat in a by-election in Carmarthen in 1966. Partly a protest vote against a railway line closure, but significant nonetheless. They started coming close in traditional Labour coal mining seats too, as pits closed. In response, the Labour government made concessions. The Welsh Language Act of 1967 gave Welsh equal legal status with English in Wales. More Welsh was used in government, on TV, in schools. Prince Charles was invested as Prince of Wales at Carnarvon Castle in 1969 and made a point of learning some Welsh. And remember, the Kilbrandon Commission was looking into devolution for Wales too. By the October 1974 election, Plaid Cymru had won 3 seats. So Welsh devolution, like Scottish, seemed a real possibility under that Labour government.
Yeah. Okay, so back again to that crucial year, 1979, and the devolution referendums. A bill for a Welsh assembly was passed by Parliament in 1978, though Lowe describes it as offering far fewer powers than Scotland's proposal, little more than a glorified county council, he says. But the referendum result in Wales in March 1979 was absolutely overwhelming against devolution. Something like 80% voted no. Even in the Welsh-speaking heartlands like Gwynedd, the majority was against. And a key factor seems to have been the Labour Party in Wales campaigning against it, believing Wales would be worse off economically outside the main UK structures. Meanwhile, of course, the economic decline in Wales continued dramatically through the 80s. The coal industry virtually disappeared. Steel plummeted too.
A resounding no in 79. Yet, despite that, the push for devolution didn't die completely. It resurfaced. By the 1997 general election, Tony Blair's Labour Party policy had swung firmly to favour creating a Welsh Assembly. Labour's huge victory swept away all Conservative MPs in Wales. Labour gained 34 out of 40 Welsh seats. It seemed to guarantee a yes vote this time. But the referendum in September 1997 was incredibly close. Just 50.3% voted for, 49.7% against, and turnout was low, only just over 50%. So really, only about 25% of the Welsh population actively backed the plan. Nevertheless, the government pressed ahead. Legislation was passed, and the 60-member National Assembly for Wales was set up in Cardiff in the summer of 1999. But as Lowe points out, it started with fewer powers than the Scottish Parliament, crucially. It couldn't levy taxes initially, and it kept a much lower public profile than Holyrood. Even its move into a fancy new building designed by Richard Rogers in 2006 went with little publicity, a much quieter path to devolution, reflecting that less assertive, more culturally focused form of nationalism compared to Ireland or Scotland.
What a journey we've covered. Looking back across these three distinct paths, it's just so clear, isn't it? Northern Ireland's violent, traumatic struggle for identity, eventually leading to that complex, fragile, power-sharing peace. Scotland's blend of cultural pride and, crucially, economic factors like oil, driving a much stronger, more politically assertive demand for greater devolution and now independence. And then Wales with its deeply rooted cultural nationalism, focusing heavily on language, resulting in a quieter, more gradual, and initially more contested push for autonomy. So reflecting on all this from Lowe's work, what does this deep dive really tell you, the listener, about the incredibly complex interplay of identity, sovereignty, and how a multinational state like the UK evolves? How do those different triggers, economic hardship, cultural preservation, political discrimination, shape national movements in such profoundly different ways?
That's absolutely right. It's not one single story, is it? This deep dive really reveals that even when constituent parts share that yearning for a separate identity, the path they take, the reasons they take it, and the outcomes, well, they're never straightforward or uniform. It truly highlights just how diverse the impulses for self-governance can be within one state.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given the hard one, if still sometimes fragile, peace in Northern Ireland, and the established devolved parliaments in Scotland and Wales, what ongoing challenges or maybe aspirations for further autonomy might still persist in these regions today? How might those strings of molten cheese that Andrew Marr described, those connections holding the UK together, how might they continue to stretch or perhaps even potentially break in the future? It's certainly something to ponder as these deep historical dynamics we've explored continue to shape the political and cultural landscape of the United Kingdom right now.